The envelope was standard size. White. No return address beyond a law firm's name on the upper left corner that I didn't recognize, which I later understood was because she had found an attorney in a different part of the city, someone with no connection to anyone we knew. A choice that told me something about how carefully this had been planned and how long ago the planning had begun. I opened it standing at the kitchen counter on a Tuesday morning, still in my coat, not yet having put down my bag, with the particular inattention you give mail that you assume is routine. The words divorce petition appeared in the first line of the first page, and I read them twice without the meaning arriving. The way certain sentences require multiple passes because the mind is doing something other than comprehension. I put the papers down on the counter. I picked them up again. I sat at the kitchen table and read every page, slowly, with the specific attention of someone trying to find the part that explains what happened, the section that would tell me what I had missed or done or failed to understand that had brought 12 years to a Tuesday morning in an envelope with no return address. There was no such section. Divorce petitions are not constructed to tell stories. They contain claims and requests and procedural language, and what they contained here was the legal architecture of an ending, without anything resembling a reason. 2 weeks earlier, she had kissed me goodbye before work the way she had kissed me goodbye before work for 12 years, quickly, in the hallway, with one hand on the door and her bag already on her shoulder. An ordinary kiss. The kind that carries the entire weight of a shared life in its brevity. 3 weeks earlier, we had looked at 2 houses in a neighborhood we'd been considering, had stood in the kitchen of the second one and talked about which wall we'd take down and where the light came in best in the afternoon. She had been enthusiastic in the specific way. She was enthusiastic about things she'd been thinking about for a while before she mentioned them. A month earlier, we had been in the office of a specialist who had given us information about the next steps in the treatment we'd been pursuing for 3 years, and she had held my hand during the appointment with the grip of someone who is frightened and doesn't want to be frightened alone. And then silence. 2 days of silence that I had attributed to exhaustion, followed by a week of careful distance that I had attributed to stress, followed by 4 days of something I had no word for except wrong. A quality of her presence that was unlike anything I had experienced in 12 years of knowing her, followed by the envelope. She did not return my calls. Her attorney responded to everything I sent to her directly with a formal notice to communicate through the legal process only. The divorce was finalized 7 months later. I never understood why. For 10 years, I believed she had stopped loving me. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about almost everything. I met Sarah in the first week of university, in a seminar on economic history that neither of us had chosen deliberately. It was a required course, and we had both registered late, which meant we were assigned to the same section by default, the kind of circumstance that is not romantic until it is. She was sitting in the 3rd row when I arrived on the first day, reading something that wasn't the course material, and she looked up when I sat down beside her with the expression of someone who has been interrupted from something interesting and is deciding whether to be annoyed about it. She decided not to be. We talked for 10 minutes before the professor arrived, which is long enough, if the conversation is the right kind, to understand that something is different about a person. The conversation was the right kind. We were both 20. We were both from cities that were not the city where the university was located, which gave us a particular kind of solidarity. People who are from somewhere else develop a slightly different relationship with wherever they've landed, more observational, less assuming. We were both studying economics, for different reasons that turned out to be more compatible than they sounded when we first explained them. We were both, in the way of 20-year-olds who come from families that don't have much surplus, acutely aware of the cost of things. That last part is important to establish early, because it's the part my mother never forgave. Sarah's family was not wealthy. This is a neutral statement about economic circumstance, and I am making it neutrally, because the neutrality is the point. There is nothing in it that required any response beyond acknowledgement. Her parents were working people who had raised their daughter with values and intelligence, and the kind of practical competence that money doesn't produce and its absence doesn't prevent. My family was different. Not dramatically different. My parents were not wealthy in any way that would have been visible to a stranger. But my mother had grown up in a family that had once had more than it currently had, and she had carried from that origin a specific, durable attachment to the idea of status that was entirely disproportionate to the actual status she and my father occupied. She had married my father partly for love, and partly for what she had believed, at 23, were his prospects, and she had spent the 30 years of their marriage quietly repositioning the narrative of their life in relation to money and class with a persistence that I had grown up inside and therefore had never fully seen. She wanted, for me, someone who came from something. That was the precise phrase she used, and I want to record it precisely because the precision matters. Not someone successful, not someone educated, not even someone wealthy in any specific and measurable way. Someone who came from something, a background, a family with a name or a house or a history, or any of the markers that my mother used to locate people in the social geography she had constructed in her own mind. Sarah came from good people. She did not come from something. My mother had understood this within the first conversation she ever had with Sarah, and she had never revised her position. The years between meeting and marrying were not easy, and I want to say that clearly because the story that follows requires that the love be real rather than idealized. Love that gets destroyed only matters, as a loss, if it was actually worth having. We were broke for most of our 20s, in the specific way of people who have chosen paths that don't pay well in the early stages. I was working in financial analysis at a firm that paid adequately and demanded more than adequately. Sarah was in the middle years of a teaching career that was deeply meaningful and persistently underfunded, in the way of teaching careers everywhere. We lived in a one-bedroom apartment for 4 years that was too small and too expensive for what it offered, and that we were nonetheless genuinely happy in, which tells you something about the relationship that the apartment's size could not contain. We survived things. I keep coming back to that phrase because it's the accurate one. We survived the year when both our cars needed significant repair in the same month, and we couldn't cover both. We survived the job I lost at 32 when the firm restructured, and I spent 6 months in the specific anxiety of professional uncertainty that I had no previous experience of. We survived the fertility issues, which arrived when we were 34, and which I will return to because they matter to what came after. My parents were present throughout all of this in the way that my parents were always present, functionally, with a kind of practical reliability that I had confused, for most of my life, with emotional investment. My father came when things needed to be done. My mother organized events and remembered dates, and maintained, with considerable skill, the performance of a close family. But she had never accepted Sarah, not privately, which was the part I only understood later. In company, she was warm enough, not effusive, but adequate, the warmth of a woman who understood that open hostility carried social costs. Privately, in conversations with my father that I had overheard enough times to understand the pattern without ever confronting it directly, she returned reliably to the same territory. Sarah's family, Sarah's background, the ways in which my life might have been different if I had made a different choice. My father said little in these conversations. This was his primary contribution to most difficult situations. I had decided, in the way that adult children sometimes decide these things, to treat my mother's position as a fixed point in the landscape rather than a problem requiring resolution. She would not change. Sarah knew she would not change. We had, between the three of us, arrived at an arrangement that was functional and not close, and I had made my peace with the fact that my marriage would never have my mother's genuine blessing. What I had not considered was that my mother might eventually stop trying to influence things honestly. What I had not considered was that she might, at some point, decide that the honest approach had failed and that a different approach was required. The clue that I missed, that I now understand I should not have missed, looking back with the advantage of knowing how it ended, was the year she became friendly with Sarah. Our wedding was held on a Saturday in September, 12 years before the envelope arrived. My mother attended with the specific grace of a woman who is committed to performing acceptance even in the absence of feeling it. She wore an appropriate dress. She said appropriate things to Sarah's parents, who were there with the evident happiness of people whose daughter was marrying someone who loved her. A happiness that was uncomplicated and genuine, and that stood in a kind of wordless contrast to my mother's more careful version. There were photographs taken that day that captured everyone smiling, which is true of most wedding photographs, and which is one of the ways that photographs mislead us about the texture of the events they record. My mother's smile in the photographs was perfect. I have not been able to look at those photographs the same way since I understood what she had already been planning, even then, for how the marriage would eventually end. Infertility is a specific kind of grief, because it is a grief for something you never had, which means you are grieving a future rather than a past. And the future keeps arriving without the thing you were expecting, and the grief accumulates in a way that is different from other kinds, because there is no event to point to, no moment when it happened, just the continuous arriving of a future that is not what you needed it to be. Sarah and I began trying when we were 32 and discovered, at 34, through the patient and occasionally dehumanizing process of medical evaluation, that the situation was complicated in ways that were not insurmountable, but that required intervention and time, and the particular emotional endurance of people who have decided that what they want is worth the cost of wanting it this hard. I am telling you this because the fertility treatments were the specific circumstance my mother used. That is not a speculation. I know it now with certainty. But at the time, when she began calling Sarah more frequently, scheduling lunches, being present in our lives in a way that was warmer and more consistent than anything that had preceded it, I told myself that the difficulty of the fertility process had prompted something genuine in her. That difficulty had a way of revealing what people actually felt about you, and my mother's increased presence felt to the version of me who wanted it to be true, like evidence that she had decided to finally let herself care about her daughter-in-law. I told Sarah I thought my mother was genuinely trying. Sarah said she hoped so. I missed the specific quality of what Sarah said. She said she hoped so, not she thinks so, not she agrees. She said she hoped so, which is what people say when they want something to be true and are not yet convinced that it is. I heard what I wanted to hear. The distance began approximately 4 months after my mother's increased involvement in our lives. Not dramatically. Sarah was not cold or hostile. She was not different in any way I could name. She was quieter, more internal. She laughed at the right moments, but the laughter had less breath in it. She came home on certain evenings with a quality of tiredness that was different from the tiredness of work, heavier and more settled, the tiredness of someone who has been carrying something all day. I asked her several times if she was all right. She said she was fine. She said she was tired from work. She said she had a lot on her mind with the treatment planning. I believed all of these things because I was the kind of person who believed what the people he loved told him, and because the alternative, that something was wrong between us in a way she wasn't willing to tell me, was something I was not yet ready to examine. The envelope arrived 11 weeks after the distance began. She was gone before I fully understood that anything had changed. And for 10 years, I carried the shape of it without understanding what it was made of. I thought she had stopped loving me. I had no idea that someone had worked very hard to make her believe that I had stopped loving her first. The decade that followed the divorce was not a decade I spent waiting. I want to be clear about that because the story would be simpler if it contained a man suspended in grief, incapable of moving, defined by loss. That wasn't what happened. I built a career that expanded in directions I hadn't anticipated when I was 22 and planning my future around Sarah. I moved to a different city for 3 years for a position that required it, and then came back because it turned out the city I'd left was where I belonged. I had relationships, none of them the length or depth of what I'd had with Sarah, but real ones with real people that mattered in the ways available to them. What I didn't do was fully put down the question, not in an obsessive way. Not in a way that anyone who knew me would have identified as grief that had become a problem, but quietly, in the way that an unanswered question lives in the background of a person's attention. I continued to not understand what had happened to my marriage, and the not understanding had a weight that I had learned to carry rather than resolve. I had never stopped loving her, which was the part I kept not examining too closely, because examining it too closely produced a particular kind of ache that I had decided, sensibly, was not productive. What I did not know was that she had never stopped loving me either. What I did not know was that she had been given a reason, and that the reason was a lie. The full shape of it I would not understand until a Thursday evening in October, 10 years after the envelope, when I walked into a restaurant for a client dinner, and Sarah was sitting at the bar. She was sitting at the bar with a glass of wine she hadn't touched, looking at her phone with the expression of someone waiting for someone who was running late. And I saw her before she saw me, which gave me approximately 3 seconds to decide what to do with the information that Sarah was in the same room. I used those 3 seconds poorly. I stopped walking. A man behind me adjusted his trajectory without comment. I stood in the entrance of the restaurant and looked at the back of her head. The same dark hair, shorter now than it had been, cut in a way that was different and somehow still recognizable as entirely her. And I went through several possible responses in rapid succession and discarded all of them before she turned, the way people turn when they sense they're being looked at, and saw me. 10 years is enough time for a face to change, and not enough time for it to become unfamiliar. She looked like herself, and also like a version of herself I hadn't seen before, which is what time does to people you knew well and then didn't see. The first expression that crossed her face was something I couldn't immediately read. Then she composed it into something more neutral, more managed, the expression of a person deciding how to handle a situation they hadn't prepared for. I walked toward her because the alternative was to walk out of the restaurant, which was where I had a client dinner in 20 minutes, and which was, at any rate, something I had apparently already decided not to do. "Sarah," I said. "James," she said. We stood for a moment with the particular awkwardness of people who spent 12 years knowing each other completely, and now don't know what register to use. "You look well," she said, which is what people say when they need to say something. "So do you," I said, which was true. She looked tired in a way that was underneath the surface rather than on it, but she also looked like someone who had built something she was comfortable inside, which was its own kind of good. Her dinner companion arrived 15 minutes later, a woman I didn't know, and we said the things people say about running into each other, and both went to our separate tables, and I sat through a client dinner while conducting, in the part of my attention not required for the dinner, a sustained internal accounting of what the previous 10 minutes had felt like. It had felt like something unfinished. Not painful exactly, or not only painful. Unfinished in the specific way of things that ended without resolution, that carried the particular weight of a question that never received an answer. I thought she had stopped loving me. Sitting at that dinner table, I was no longer certain that was true. There had been something in her face when she first saw me that I had filed and was now examining in the back of my mind. Something that didn't match the expression of a woman looking at someone she had finished with. I sent her a message that evening, carefully worded. The kind of message that asks a question without looking like it's asking a question. Whether she'd be open to having coffee sometime, catching up, the phrasing of someone who wants more than the words say, but is unwilling to say so directly. She replied the next morning, yes, if he wanted to. We met at a coffee shop on a Saturday morning 2 weeks later, which was enough time for both of us to have prepared and not enough time to have prepared properly, which was probably the right amount. She was there when I arrived, at a table near the window, and she had the quality that people have when they've decided to do something difficult and have committed to doing it without quite knowing what doing it is going to cost them. We talked around things for the first 20 minutes, the way people talk around things when they need to establish that the talking is possible before they get to the things themselves. She told me about her work, which had evolved in directions that suited her. I told her about mine. We acknowledged, with a kind of mutual, careful relief, that both of us had built lives that functioned. Then she put down her coffee cup and looked at me for a moment with the specific expression of someone deciding to say something they've been not saying for a long time. "Can I ask you something?" she said. I said yes. "Why did you never admit it?" she said. "Afterward, after everything, I always thought eventually you would reach out and say something, even just acknowledge it. And you never did, and I never understood why." I looked at her. "Admit what?" I said. The expression that crossed her face in response to those 2 words is something I have thought about many times since, because it contained, in compressed form, the entire 10 years. It moved through several stages in rapid succession: confusion, a flinching recalibration, something that looked, very briefly, like the beginning of a question she didn't want to be asking. "What do you mean, admit what?" she said. "I don't know what you're asking me to admit," I said. "I've never known. I didn't know then and I don't know now. That's the thing I've carried for 10 years. I never understood what happened. She was looking at me with an expression that had gone very still. You don't know, she said, not a question. A statement being tested for truth. No, I said, I've never known. A silence that had a different quality from the silences earlier in the conversation. This one was doing something. She was examining my face the way you examine something you've been certain about for a long time and are suddenly not certain about, looking for the thing that would confirm one version or the other. I was shown evidence, she said finally. Before I filed, several months before, I was shown evidence that you had been seeing someone else. I said nothing for a moment. I have never been unfaithful to you, I said. Not once, not in any form. She looked at me. There were photographs, she said, and messages, and a woman who called me directly, and there was a lot of it, James. It wasn't one thing. It was, she stopped. It was constructed. It looked constructed, actually, now that I'm saying it out loud to someone who is looking at me the way you're looking at me. But at the time, I was already in a certain state of mind, and I was given it in a certain way. And she stopped again. I believed it. Who showed it to you? I said. She told me. The name did not surprise me. What surprised me was how long it took me to understand that it shouldn't have surprised me. She brought the evidence to the coffee shop on a different day, a week after our first conversation. In a folder she'd kept for 10 years with the specific thoroughness of someone who needed the record of the reason they'd done something as painful as leaving a marriage. I looked at it carefully. I took my time with each element, in the way I had learned across a career in financial analysis, to take time with documents that matter and not to allow the emotional weight of what they contain to rush the examination. The photographs, several of them, showing a man who looked like me from angles and distances that were not close, with a woman I didn't recognize, in settings that were generic enough to be anywhere. They had been printed rather than shown digitally, which meant there were no metadata embedded in a file, no timestamps recoverable from an image itself. The messages, printed as well, showing a conversation between a number identified as mine and an unidentified recipient, with content that was damning in the specific way of things designed to be damning, intimate enough to be conclusive, brief enough to not contain anything that required knowledge of my actual life. The witness, a woman identified to Sarah by name, who had reportedly told Sarah directly that she had seen me with someone at a location I sometimes visited. I read through all of it twice. Then I went back to the photographs. There were 7 of them. I placed them in the order they had been presented to Sarah, which she had noted on the folder, and I looked at the sequence. The third photograph. I looked at the third photograph for a long time. It showed a man who looked like me outside a restaurant I recognized, a place I had gone to periodically for work lunches, distinctive enough in its exterior that it was identifiable. The man in the photograph was with a woman. They were standing close together in the way the photograph wanted you to interpret as intimate. I knew where I had been on the day. That photograph was dated, not approximately, precisely. Because the date on the photograph, handwritten on the back, which I had initially read as a date and then reread and reread again, was the same date as my father's emergency cardiac procedure, during which I had spent 9 hours in a hospital waiting room 200 miles from the restaurant in the photograph. 9 hours. In a waiting room, with my mother sitting beside me. This photograph is impossible, I said. Sarah looked at me. I showed her the date. I told her where I had been. I told her that my mother had been there with me, that there were hospital records, that there were timestamps on the dozen messages I had sent to family members and colleagues during those 9 hours explaining why I was unreachable that day. Sarah looked at the date. Then she looked at me. She was with you, Sarah said. Your mother was in that waiting room. Yes, I said. And she's the one who showed me this photograph, Sarah said. The coffee shop was very quiet around us. I want to be methodical about what I did next, because methodical is what the situation required, and methodical is what I was capable of. And emotion was something I was putting in a separate container until the facts were established. The photographs had been printed, which meant the originals were digital, which meant the originals had metadata even if the prints did not. I contacted a forensic imaging specialist, a person whose professional existence I had not been aware of before this situation, and whose existence I was now extremely grateful for, and explained what I needed. She was clear about what was and wasn't recoverable from printed photographs, without access to the original files, and equally clear about what other digital traces might be recoverable if I could identify where the images had originated. I could not, immediately, identify where they had originated. What I could do was start with what I had. The number that had been shown to Sarah as mine in the printed messages was not my number. It was close, the same area code, similar enough that a quick look would not catch the difference. It was a number that had been active for a limited period and had since been disconnected, which told me it had been created for a purpose and deactivated once that purpose was served. The witness, the woman who had reportedly called Sarah and told her she had seen me with someone, had a name. It was a name I did not recognize. Sarah had met her once, briefly, in a context that had been arranged by my mother, a lunch at which my mother had brought along a friend of a friend, introduced casually, the kind of social occasion that creates the appearance of an established relationship without actually building one. I tracked down that woman. It required several weeks and a private investigator, whose services I engaged with the specific, focused intention of someone who has decided they need to know something and is willing to pay to know it. She lived in a suburb 40 minutes from the city. She was a retired administrative assistant with 2 adult children and a garden she apparently tended with considerable devotion based on the state of her front yard. When I stood on her porch on a Thursday afternoon and knocked, she opened the door and looked at me with no recognition. None. Not the careful non-recognition of someone managing their expression. The genuine, complete non-recognition of someone looking at a stranger. "Can I help you?" she said. I told her my name. She said nothing that indicated she'd heard it before. I asked her whether she had ever contacted a woman named Sarah, 10 years ago, to tell her she had seen her husband with another woman. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "I was told you were in trouble, that your wife needed to know the truth about you, and that I would be helping her by making the call. I was told the evidence was real, and I was just confirming something that had already been established." She paused. "I was told by a woman who said she was a family friend who was worried about you both." "What did this woman look like?" I said. She described my mother. I had prepared myself, in the weeks of the investigation, for what I was likely to find. I had assembled the evidence with the understanding that it pointed in one direction, and that the direction was not one I could process fully while I was still assembling it. I had compartmentalized, in the way I was capable of compartmentalizing, putting the emotional weight of it in the container that was waiting. What I had not fully prepared myself for was the specific detail that broke the compartment open. It was the hospital records. I had obtained a copy of my father's cardiac procedure records, not for use as evidence, initially, just to confirm what I already knew about where I had been on the day of the 3rd photograph. The records confirmed the date and the 9-hour duration and my presence in the waiting room, documented in the nursing notes as the patient's son who had been present throughout. Also documented, in the same nursing notes, my mother, present throughout. She had sat in that waiting room with me for 9 hours, while my father was in surgery, and she had used that date, the date of her own husband's cardiac procedure, the date when I was provably, documentably, irrefutably elsewhere, as the date on one of the photographs she had fabricated to end my marriage. She had done it knowing that I was with her. She had done it either not expecting anyone to check, or expecting that by the time anyone checked, the marriage would be long over, and the checking would be pointless. I sat with that for a very long time. Then I opened the container. The former family friend who finally told me the complete story was a woman named Margaret, who had been close to my parents for most of my childhood, and who had, at some point in the years since, quietly moved to the periphery of their social world in a way that I had not examined at the time, but that now, retroactively, I understood. She had been present for some of it. Not the execution. She hadn't known about the fabricated messages or the photographs or the woman on the porch who had been recruited to make a call. But she had been present for the conversations that preceded the execution, and she had heard enough to understand what my mother was planning long before it happened. She had said nothing at the time, which was the part she found most difficult to tell me. She had convinced herself that she had misunderstood, that my mother's expressions of intention had been venting rather than planning, that people said things in frustration that they didn't follow through on, and she had applied that framework to what she'd heard, and had moved on, and had subsequently watched my marriage end from a distance, and had lived with what she had not done for a decade. She told me now, because Sarah had recently contacted her. Sarah, it turned out, had been doing her own quiet investigation since our coffee shop conversations. She had been less certain about what she was looking for, but equally certain that something needed to be looked for, and she had reached out to several people from the years of our marriage to ask careful questions about what they remembered. Margaret had been on her list. What did she want? I asked. What you wanted, Margaret said. The truth. I asked her to tell me everything she knew. She did. My mother had, in the 18 months before the divorce, constructed what Margaret described as a campaign. Not impulsively, not in a moment of anger. Deliberately, over time. She had identified the specific vulnerability, the fertility treatments, the emotional exhaustion, the condition of a marriage that was strong but stressed, and she had used it. She had found a woman, willing to be photographed. She had created a phone number. She had fabricated a conversation. She had recruited a woman she knew casually to make a call, describing it in terms that were charitable enough that the woman had believed she was doing something kind. And she had timed the presentation of the evidence to a moment when Sarah was most fragile, most worn down by the accumulated weight of 3 years of medical intervention and the emotional cost of hoping and being disappointed. She had chosen a Friday evening. She had arrived at our home when she knew I would not be there. She had sat with my wife for 2 hours. The reason, Margaret said, was not complicated, though it was worse for being simple. My mother had identified someone she wanted me to be with. A woman from a family she considered appropriate. The connection had been suggested to her years earlier, and she had never stopped pursuing it as a possibility. And at some point, she had decided that the most efficient path to the outcome she wanted was to remove the obstacle rather than wait for it to disappear. The obstacle was Sarah, the woman she had married me to her social idea of what I should be. Sarah was the life I had chosen. My mother had decided she preferred the one she had chosen for me. I sat with everything Margaret told me in her living room on an afternoon in November that was gray and cold outside the window. I thought about the 2 hours my mother had spent in my living room with my wife. I thought about what had been said in those 2 hours and how carefully it must have been designed and how thoroughly it had worked. I thought about 12 years of a marriage and 10 years of its absence and a Tuesday morning envelope and all the ordinary days in between that had been quietly, completely shaped by a lie that one woman had constructed and another had believed because she had no reason not to. And I thought about what I was going to do next, not with anger, with the specific clarity of someone who has finally found all the pieces and can see the whole shape of what was broken and what it was going to take to address it. The shape was very clear, and it was going to require one more conversation. Several of them, actually, starting with my mother. I called my mother on a Sunday morning and told her I needed to see her. I did not tell her why. I had considered whether to give her advance warning of what the conversation was going to contain, and I had decided against it for the same reason I had decided against giving her advance warning of almost anything during the investigation. Not out of strategy, exactly, but out of a recognition that prepared people prepare their accounts, and I needed her account to be unprepared. She was in the kitchen when I arrived, which was where she usually was on Sunday mornings, and she had made coffee with the specific hospitality she deployed for my visits. Good coffee. The kind she didn't make for herself. The kind that was a statement of welcome that I had always received as genuine and was now receiving with considerably more complexity. I sat at the kitchen table. I put the folder on the table between us. I watched her look at it. She looked at it the way people look at things they recognize, not with the curiosity of someone encountering something new, but with the specific attention of someone identifying something they've seen before. It was a brief look, quickly controlled, but I had been watching for it and I caught it. I need to tell you what I know, I said, and I need you to listen to all of it before you say anything. She sat down across from me. I walked through it, the photographs and what was wrong with them, the phone number that wasn't mine, the woman on the porch who had described her to me without knowing she was describing her, Margaret, the hospital records and the date and the 9 hours in the waiting room. I laid each piece on the table as I went, the way I had done in other difficult conversations over the past year, because the physical presence of paper has a weight that spoken words sometimes don't. I placed each document, and I let her read it before I moved to the next one. She was quiet throughout, not the quiet of someone absorbing new information, the quiet of someone deciding, word by word, what their position is going to be. When I finished, I waited. "Where did you get all of this?" she said. "That's your first question," I said. She looked at the table. "I didn't," she started. "Mom," I said. She stopped. "I have the hospital records," I said. "I have Margaret's account. I have the woman on the porch. I have the phone records for a number that existed for 4 months and was deactivated the month after Sarah filed. I have enough that your attorney, if you choose to involve one, will tell you that the honest conversation is the better option." A long silence. Outside, the Sunday morning street was quiet in the way of streets, where most people are still inside. The quiet that has a specific texture that is different from the quiet of an empty street. My mother looked at her hands. Then she said, "I thought she wasn't right for you." I said nothing. "I thought," she said, and her voice had changed, had dropped into something lower and less managed, "that you deserved something better than what she could give you. I thought if you had more time, if you weren't committed, you would find someone who could." "Give me what exactly?" I said. She was quiet. "Say it," I said, not unkindly, but without any available softness either. "Someone from a better situation," she said. "Someone whose family had someone who could help you build something. Sarah was a good person. I never said she wasn't a good person. But she came from nothing, and I thought." "You thought that was a reason to end my marriage," I said. She looked up. "I thought I was helping you," she said. I looked at my mother, a woman I had known my entire life, whose face I had learned before I had language to describe it, whose hands had been the first hands I remembered. And I understood, with a finality that had nothing dramatic in it, that the thing she had just said was true. Not true as a justification. True as a description. She had genuinely believed she was acting in my interest. She had looked at Sarah and seen an obstacle, and at me, and seen a better version of my life that was unavailable to me while Sarah was in it. And she had operated from that belief with the complete, uncritical confidence of a person who has never seriously questioned whether their vision of someone else's happiness might be wrong. She had destroyed my marriage in order to improve my life. The gap between those two things, what she believed she was doing and what she had actually done, was the thing I sat with for the rest of that conversation. "I need you to understand something," I said. "Not for me, I think I'm past needing you to understand it for me. For yourself, for whatever version of your life comes after today." She looked at me. "You didn't help me," I said. "You made a choice for me that you had no right to make. You decided, without asking, without knowing, without the smallest consideration that your version of my happiness might not be what my happiness actually was. You decided what I should have. And then you removed what I had in order to make room for it." I paused. "And then I spent 10 years building a life without the person I wanted to build it with. And you spent 10 years watching that and calling it success." She was crying by then. The quiet kind, the kind that comes when something has been held back for long enough that the body eventually stops cooperating with the decision to hold it back. I did not comfort her. I had brought myself to this conversation with everything required to have it clearly and honestly, and I did not have anything left for comfort. "Is there anything else I should know?" I said. "Anything I haven't found?" She shook her head. "The woman," I said. "The one you wanted me to be with instead." A pause. "It doesn't matter now," she said. "No," I said, "it doesn't." I stood up. I collected the documents from the table, replacing them in the folder with the care of someone who understands they are still going to need them. "I don't know what our relationship looks like from here," I said. "I need time to understand that. What I know right now is that I'm going to have a conversation with Sarah, and I'm going to tell her everything, and whatever comes from that conversation is going to be what it is. And I need you to stay away from that. Completely. Whatever the outcome, it belongs to us, and you've already had more involvement in it than you were entitled to." She nodded. She was still looking at the table. I left. My father called me 3 days later. He didn't say much. My father had never been a man who said much in the moments that required the most saying, and this was not an exception. He said he had talked to my mother. I said I assumed he had. He said he was sorry. Not an elaborated apology, not a speech, not an explanation of what he had or hadn't known, or when he had or hadn't known it. Just the word, offered with the weight of a man who understood it was insufficient and was offering it anyway because it was what he had. I told him I appreciated it. He asked if there was anything he could do. I told him not right now. We were quiet for a moment on the phone. The specific quiet of a father and son who are on the same side of something for the first time in a long time and don't quite know yet how to use that position. I didn't know the extent of it, he said. I want you to know that. I know, I said. I knew she wasn't happy about Sarah. I didn't, he stopped. I should have paid more attention. Yes, I said. You should have. It was the most honest exchange we'd had in years, possibly ever. And we ended the call shortly after it. And I sat with the quiet it left behind and thought about the specific damage done by people who do not pay enough attention to what the people they love are capable of. The relatives who learned the full story over the following months did so through the natural movement of information in a family that had been keeping a significant secret, which is to say the information moved on its own timeline and through its own channels and arrived with its own consequences. My mother's social world contracted. The ease she had always had in family gatherings, the confidence of a woman who had never been held accountable for anything she had managed away from public view, became something more careful, more effortful, in the way that ease always becomes effortful when the stories holding it up have been replaced with something closer to truth. I am not going to say this satisfied me. I want to be honest about that because satisfaction would imply that the consequences to her were the point, and they weren't. The point was what had been done and what might still be recoverable from it. The consequences to her were simply what happened when the weight of a decade of deception was finally distributed to the people who had been carrying it without knowing it. Sarah and I met at the coffee shop again. Third visit. The table near the window had become, without either of us deciding this, our table, the geographic anchor of the conversations that were reassembling something between us piece by piece. I had told her about Margaret's account by phone, in a call that had lasted 2 hours, and that had contained, on her end, a silence after each significant piece of information that was different from the silence of someone processing, and more like the silence of someone going back through 10 years of memory and revising what they found there. Now she had the complete picture. Everything I'd found, in the order I'd found it, including the hospital records and what they meant about the date on the third photograph. She had read everything twice. She was looking at the window when I arrived, and she had the expression of someone who has been sitting alone with something very large and is not sure yet what shape it is going to take. We ordered coffee. We were quiet for a moment. She sat in my living room, Sarah said, for 2 hours, and I asked her. I remember asking her whether she was certain, whether there was any other explanation. And she stopped. She cried while she was telling me. She said she'd agonized over whether to tell me and had finally decided that I deserved to know. I listened. I believed her completely, Sarah said. Not just because of the evidence, because she seemed so genuinely reluctant, like she was telling me something that was costing her something. It was a performance, I said. I know that now, she said. But she had been kind to me for months before that, and I had convinced myself that she was finally on our side. And so when she came to me with something so serious in that state, she shook her head. I thought she was protecting me from you. The coffee shop moved around us. The ordinary sounds of a Saturday morning, the espresso machine, conversations at other tables, a child somewhere being told not to run indoors. James, she said. I looked at her. I never stopped loving you, she said. I want you to know that. I left because I believed what I'd been shown, not because I stopped. She looked at the table and then back at me. I spent a long time trying to stop because it would have been easier if I had. But I didn't. I sat with that. 10 years of a question, answered in 2 sentences. I never stopped either, I said. We were quiet for a moment that lasted longer than most moments and contained considerably more than most moments contain. I don't know what that means, I said. For now, for what comes next, I don't think we can know that yet. No, she said, we can't. But I think we should find out, I said. She looked at me with the expression I remembered from the 3rd row of a seminar room on the first day of university, 24 years earlier. The expression of someone who has been interrupted from something and is deciding whether to be annoyed or interested, and has decided to be interested. Yes, she said. What came next was not a restoration. I want to be clear about that because the story would be simpler if it were. If Sarah and I had looked at each other across a coffee shop table and decided that the 10 years were simply a thing that had happened and that love was enough to span them without effort. That's not what happened. What happened was slower and more complicated, and in its complication, more real. We spent several months in the specific uncertainty of two people who know they want to be in each other's lives and don't yet know what shape that takes. We had dinners that were easy and conversations that were hard and evenings that ended earlier than either of us wanted because the pace required by the situation was slower than what we felt. We had, between us, the accumulated history of 12 years that had been real and 10 years that had been absence, and all the ways that both of those things had shaped us into people who were recognizably ourselves, and also not the people we'd been when we'd first been together. The rebuilding required honesty about all of it. It required Sarah to tell me what the years after the divorce had actually been like. Not the functional version she'd shared when we first reconnected, but the real one, with the specific texture of grief that had lived in it and the specific difficulty of living inside a story about your marriage that turned out not to be true. It required me to tell her what the years had been like for me, including the parts where I had been angry at her, the anger that had never resolved because it had no legitimate target. That had just lived in me for years as a kind of low-grade confusion, and how the anger had eventually become something quieter and sadder that I had learned to carry without letting it define too much. We told each other the truth about the years we had missed, and the truth was hard, and we told it anyway. And that was the thing that made what followed possible. 2 years after the coffee shop, I was clearing out the storage unit I had been meaning to clear out for approximately 4 years, which had become the repository of everything from my apartment that I didn't use and hadn't yet decided what to do with. Most of it was the ordinary accumulation of a life, furniture that had been replaced, boxes of documents that should have been digitized years ago, the artifacts of previous versions of oneself that don't fit in the current version, but feel wrong to throw away. In the third row of boxes, behind a lamp I no longer remembered owning, I found a box labeled with my own handwriting from approximately 15 years earlier. Inside it were the things from our first apartment together. Small things, mostly. A mug we'd bought at a street fair in the first year. A paperback novel Sarah had been reading when I met her that she'd apparently given me at some point, and that had traveled with me ever since without my knowing it. A collection of receipts and ticket stubs, and the small paper debris of a life being lived, which we had apparently been saving in a jar on the kitchen shelf in that apartment, and which I had, when we moved, transferred to a box without going through. And at the bottom, in an envelope, a photograph. University. First year, possibly first semester, before we knew how anything was going to turn out. 2 people standing outside a building I recognized as near the economics department, close together in the way of people who have recently decided to stand close together and are still slightly conscious of the decision. Smiling, not at the camera, at something that had just happened, something the photograph didn't capture. One of those moments of private amusement that become impossible to reconstruct in retrospect, but that existed, clearly and completely, in the expressions of the 2 people in the frame. 2 broke students, holding hands, smiling at a future they couldn't see. I sat on a box in the storage unit and looked at that photograph for a while. Then I heard her voice behind me. She had come to help with the storage unit, which she was better at than I was, sorting, deciding, the practical determination to not keep things that didn't serve any purpose. She was in the 3rd row now, looking at what I was looking at. I held up the photograph. She came and looked at it over my shoulder. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Outside the storage unit, the city was making its ordinary sounds. Traffic and somewhere a dog and the ambient noise of a Saturday afternoon, in a place where many people were living many lives simultaneously without much awareness of each other. We had no idea, she said. No, I said. I'm glad we didn't, she said. I think if I'd known what was coming, I would have been terrified. I think you would have done it anyway, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said, probably. She put her hand on my shoulder, the casual, familiar gesture of a person who has been relearning the physical language of someone they used to know completely, and have been relearning for 2 years. And we looked at the photograph together for a moment longer. Then she went back to sorting, and I put the photograph in the keep pile. And the storage unit smelled like dust and old paper, and the specific accumulated scent of a life held in boxes. And neither of us said much else for a while, and neither of us needed to. My mother had spent 10 years building a lie that had lived between us like a wall. The wall was gone. What remained was what had always been there underneath it. 2 people who had found each other in the 3rd row of an economics seminar and had not, in the deepest sense of the word, ever really stopped. The truth had taken one afternoon to begin dismantling what the lie had built. The rest had taken 2 years, and patience, and the specific willingness to let things be as complicated as they actually were rather than as simple as we might have preferred. It had been worth every difficult part of it. It had, in the end, been exactly what it had always been. Ours,